altogether, this is the challenge of our lifetimes. There's really nothing more important than this. This tells the tale about whether we survive climate change or not, whether we have functional economies 100 years from now or not, whether we fight over the last drops of oil or leave oil behind, perhaps for future generations to find something good to use it for. I don't know. But this is the cause of our times. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you for the wonderful work you're doing here and for all the other organizers of today's terrific event. Well, I didn't start out as a physicist or an engineer. I became a writer out of awareness that the world is in a perilous place and that there are things of amazing and awesome import happening in our lifetime. And I wanted to see if I could understand this systemic crisis better. So I thought, well, what better way to give myself permission and opportunity to do that than to become a writer? But after a while, once I began writing mostly about environmental issues, I realized that energy is really at the crux of it all. First of all, energy is everything. Without energy, literally nothing happens in the entire universe. But also, energy is at the crossroads of the issues that are impacting us today. The environmental issues, the economic issues, issues of geopolitics, war and peace, and more. Now, we humans used renewable energy, basically energy from the sun, for 99.9% of our time on Earth as a species. We used it in the form of food that we hunted or gathered or grew. We used it in the form of firewood. And we exerted energy into our environment to change it, to get what we wanted and needed by way of muscle power. These simple forms of energy were developed over the course of millennia and centuries into the agrarian economies that have existed over the past few centuries, based mostly, again, on muscle power. All of that changed dramatically with what we usually call the Industrial Revolution, but really ought to be called the fossil fuel revolution. Because with fossil fuels, we suddenly had access to energy sources that were completely unlike anything we had before. Remember back to the last time you ran out of gas in your car and had to push your car off to the side of the road. That's a lot of work. How much work would it be to push your car, let's say 30 miles? That's a real lot of work, maybe 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor. We get that done for us by a single gallon of gasoline for which we're paying less than $3. So 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor energy equivalent for less than $3, that's incredibly cheap, concentrated, portable energy that has enabled us to build the modern world. In effect, each of us has hundreds of energy slaves. If you counted the amount of energy that would have to be exerted in human labor to, wash our clothes, push us around, connect us to the internet, light our buildings, heat our buildings, all of that, if all of that had to be done with muscle power, each of us would have to have hundreds of slaves following us around all that. We're living essentially like kings and queens as a result of these fuels. But of course, there are a couple of problems with fossil fuels, one of which of course, is that burning them is destroying the Earth's climate. And this isn't a climate change talk. I trust that all of you understand the perils of the chemistry experiment that we have embarked upon, not only with the Earth's atmosphere, but also the chemistry of the Earth's oceans. I'm sure you're all aware that the last 6 months of 2016 have been each and every month setting a historic record in terms of temperatures. The other problem with fossil fuels, of course, is the fact that these are finite, non-renewable resources. So from the first barrel of oil that we pulled out of the ground back in the 1860s until now, we have been in the process of running out. It's not as though, we will get the last barrel of oil out of the ground anytime soon. But we've been extracting these resources, coal, oil, and natural gas, using the low-hanging fruit principle. So we go after the cheap, easy stuff first, and as time goes on, the remaining resources are of lower and lower quality. Now that's a theoretical principle, but the real-life implications of that are starting to dawn on us. Today's oil and gas industry is not your father's or grandfather's oil and gas industry. There's no more conventional oil or natural gas waiting to be discovered in North America, and very little of it elsewhere in the world. Today, our future resources of fossil fuels consist of unconventional oil and gas. That means we have to go out to deep water or use technologies like hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling to get at inherently lower quality resources that can't be produced by simply drilling a conventional vertical well. But these are, as I say, of inherently lower quality. So even though we have technologies to get the stuff out of the ground, a shale gas or tight oil well depletes very rapidly compared to a conventional oil or gas well. And it's only profitable to drill in the sweet spots, the very best locations within the existing plays, which may be large in geographical extent. I mean, if you look at a map of the Marcellus play in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, this very large geographic area, but there are only small regions within that larger geographic area where it's actually profitable to drill. And at current prices, it's not profitable even in those places. So the cost of production has been skyrocketing for the fossil fuel industry in the last few years. But meanwhile, what's happened is that the industry overproduced over the short term and has driven prices down to a level where basically no one is making money. And there's general carnage within the oil and gas industry. So we're seeing many small to medium-sized companies in the process of going bankrupt or being bought up. And upstream projects are being canceled left and right. So this has implications for future supplies. Now, if you question future oil and natural gas developments, all of this sounds like good news. And in many ways it is. But it's a little complicated because we depend currently on these energy sources for a stable economy and also for enough energy to supply our current needs and also to build out the infrastructure that we're going to need for our next energy economy. We actually use fossil fuels to build solar panels, wind turbines, and all of the infrastructure that we're going to need in the future. So what all of this means is that, in fact, we have a very short window of time in which we're likely to have a stable energy economy within which to lay the foundations for our next energy economy. If we wait too long to build that next energy economy, we may not have the wherewithal to build much of one. So, over the last year, I've worked with another one of our post-carbon institute fellows, David Fridley, who's a staff scientist at the Energy Analysis Program at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and has had decades of experience in renewable energy projects, especially in China, but also elsewhere, looking at the renewable energy transition. We wanted to find out for ourselves what the capabilities of solar and wind power are, where we are now in relation to where we need to be in the course of this transition, and what the implications are. Now, there are a lot of good things going on in the renewable energy transition, things to celebrate. Prices for solar and wind power are dropping and dropping fast. So if you follow out the price trajectory, within just a few years, these are going to be by far the cheapest sources of new electrical energy. Also, going forward, we're talking about energy sources that don't involve depleting non-renewable fuels. So as fossil fuels get more and more expensive to extract, basically the other trend is happening with renewable energy technology. Sunlight isn't getting any more expensive, neither is wind, and the technologies we use to harvest sunlight and wind are getting cheaper. So this is good. On the other hand, there are some inherent challenges with renewable energy. These are uncontrollable, intermittent sources of energy. The sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow, and we have to accept the fact that there are environmental costs also associated with renewable energy. They're far less than the environmental costs associated with especially coal, but also natural gas and oil. But nevertheless, building solar panels and wind turbines and installing them requires energy and materials. It requires extracting non-renewable resources from the Earth's crust and transforming them. So we ultimately have to ask ourselves, how many of these environmental costs are we interested in taking on? There are controversies in many places about building wind turbines on ridgelines. We want to preserve a pristine environment. We all want to have a beautiful view of the natural world around us. So some folks, including environmentalists, don't want those wind turbines there, okay? But that's an environmental cost of the renewable energy transition that ultimately forces us to have the question, to have the conversation, what energy do we want and how much of it do we need? This is what's called a Sankey diagram, and it looks really complicated, and I know you can't read the words on this diagram. On the left-hand side are the energy sources that we are currently depending on, everything from solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, geothermal, natural gas, coal, biomass, and petroleum. And on the far end are areas where we use energy. But what the important thing to get from this diagram is energy is moving from these sources toward two end areas. One is energy services, which is the gray box on the far right, the dark gray box, and waste energy, which is the light gray box just above it. And you'll notice that the light gray box is bigger than the dark gray box. So we waste most of the energy that we produce in the modern industrial world. How do we do that? Well, we waste an enormous amount in producing electricity, in burning coal and natural gas to produce electricity. 50–60% of that energy is lost in the process. Then in transportation, when we drive internal combustion engine cars, most of the energy of that gasoline is actually being lost as waste heat. Very little of it is actually pushing us along the highway. So there are some big advantages to the renewable energy transition in that solar and wind produce electricity directly. We're not burning fuels to produce electricity, so there's no waste energy in the conversion process. Also, as we electrify more and more of our energy usage, we'll be using energy more efficiently. An electric car, let's say a Nissan Leaf, most of the energy, maybe 90 or 95% of the energy with which you're charging the battery and moving down the highway, is actually pushing that car along as opposed to ending up as waste heat. So we'll need a lot less energy as we transition. But there are still some other challenges. I mentioned intermittency. This is what intermittency actually looks like. This is hourly wind generation in Spain, Germany, UK, and France in 2013. So this is a large geographic area in Europe. And I point out that it's a large geographic area because, you know, our hope is that as we build out renewable energy generation capacity over a large scale, if the wind isn't blowing in one place, maybe it'll be blowing someplace else, or if the wind isn't blowing, maybe the sun will be shining, and these sources will sort of balance each other out. That's true up to a point, but not entirely so. I mean, here we have a large geographic area, but there are still lots of peaks and valleys there where we may be wanting to use electricity, but wind power isn't producing it. Then there's the question of the built infrastructure. Over the course of the last 150 years, we've built massive energy-consuming infrastructure on the basis of the characteristics of the energy sources that we had at hand. So we would like to think that these new energy sources will be drop-in substitutes for the energy sources that we're currently using, but in many cases they aren't. And in fact, the energy usage infrastructure, in order to optimize these new energy sources, will have to look very different. Here's another challenge. Over the course of our human past, we've gone through several energy transitions: the development of fire, agriculture, wind power in the I'm not talking about modern wind electricity, but using wind for grinding as a power source in medieval to Renaissance Europe. And now the fossil fuel revolution, and even adding nuclear power over the course of the 1960s and 70s up to the present. In each case up to this point, it's been an additive process. We've added new energy sources on top of existing ones. We still use firewood, less of it on a per capita basis, but on a total basis, we're still using a heck of a lot of firewood globally and here in the US. So adding coal, then natural gas, then oil, then natural gas, then nuclear, now some solar and wind on top of energy sources that we always had, and constantly growing the total amount of energy that we're using. Now what we're talking about doing is a substitutive process. doing away with our primary energy sources currently, coal, oil, and natural gas, and replacing them with alternative energy sources. This is something that we really haven't done before, at least not on the scale that we're talking about doing it. So it's going to be a challenge that will require something more than the free market. You know, if we just wait for the price of solar and wind electricity to drop enough so that it's significantly below the cost of coal-based and gas-based electricity, we will have waited much too long. The market is not going to drive this transition fast enough to deal either with depletion or, and certainly not, with climate change. Now, I mentioned solar and wind produce electricity directly. Often, when we talk about the renewable energy transition, we use the terms energy and electricity as if they mean the same thing. And of course, electricity is a form of energy. But only about 20% of the energy that we use in modern industrial societies is used in the form of electricity. Most of the other energy that we use is used as liquid fuels for transportation, as natural gas for building heat, for heating hot water, and industrial uses. So it's not just a matter of building solar panels and wind turbines to replace coal power plants and natural gas power plants. That other 80% of our energy usage has to be addressed, and that's going to be a bigger and longer term job. So when David Fridley and I looked at this large scale transition, we were able to identify some easier and some more challenging aspects of the transition. And I want to walk you through some of these things. This is a very short summary of a pretty complicated subject. The easy stuff is going to have to be done pretty much simultaneously with the harder stuff, but it's worthwhile breaking out the things that we can expect to accomplish relatively soon and with relatively little difficulty, as opposed to the things that are going to take longer and are going to take research and development and harder work. When we're talking about the easy stuff, I think just about everyone who's involved with energy transition work agrees that where we need to start is with coal power generation. Obviously, coal is the worst climate offender, the most CO2 per unit of electricity produced. And we could replace our existing coal plants relatively quickly and cheaply with solar and wind. So that's really where we should start. But there are some other things that we could do right off the bat with technologies we already have. Here in the Northeast, a lot of energy is used for building heat. We have technologies around air source and ground source heat pumps. Now these use electricity, but they're far, far more efficient than the old resistance heaters that most of us are familiar with, baseboard heaters and so on. So changing out our existing natural gas heaters for mostly air source heat pumps is something we could do right now. That doesn't immediately get us to renewable energy, but it makes the use of renewable energy for home heating cheaper and easier to accomplish. The same thing with transportation. We can begin to electrify transport with some more electric cars. Now, electric cars are not a panacea. They're not a full solution to the problem because building automobiles is extremely energy and materials intensive. It's a very inherently energy and material inefficient way of moving people around. Nevertheless, we can begin to electrify the process using electric cars. And actually, the embodied energy in an electric car is greater than the embodied energy in a standard internal combustion vehicle. The difference is, over the course of its lifetime, the electric car will be using less energy and certainly less fossil fuel energy. But a much more efficient way of moving people around is just getting people out walking and bicycling more, making it easier for people to get to where they need to go without getting in a personal powered vehicle in the first place. Another thing we could electrify more is cooking. How many of us use natural gas for cooking? This is one of the ways that we tie ourselves into the fossil fuel system. And this is all about extricating ourselves personally as well as communities from fossil fuels. Then our food system. Our food system as it exists is overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. We use about 10 to 12 calories of fossil energy to produce and move and process and deliver each calorie of food energy. And needless to say, most of those calories invested in producing and processing and moving food are fossil fuels. So getting rid of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, we know how to do this in principle. Organic farming has been pioneered for decades. Reducing processing and packaging, so when you go to buy your food, look for ways to reduce packaging and buy less processed foods, and localize food systems to reduce the need for transport. We know how to do these things. There's already a robust local food movement and network, a series of networks across the country. Again, this is in the category of the easier stuff. Now let's get into somewhat more challenging areas. We've already replaced coal, but how about replacing natural gas in electricity generation? That's going to be harder. Why? Because how do we use natural gas in electricity generation? Very often we use it in peaking plants. Let's get back to the intermittency of solar and wind. How do we balance out that intermittency? We have to have some other electricity source that we can fire up rapidly to produce electricity in those moments or hours or days when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And right now, we use natural gas to do that because natural gas power plants, generally speaking, can be fired up on virtually a moment's notice to accomplish that. So if we're going to take natural gas out of the mix, that means we're going to have to find other ways of balancing out that intermittency. So what does that mean? Well, it means, among other things, more energy storage. Energy storage is getting cheaper. We're getting better batteries. Batteries are, however, inherently expensive and somewhat inefficient ways of storing electricity. There are other ways of doing it. We can pump water uphill. When we have an abundance of electricity, we can pump water uphill into reservoirs so we can let it flow back down later when we need that energy and capture the energy in turbines and produce more electricity then. But we don't have enough reservoirs nor enough, good geologic sites where we can build more reservoirs to accomplish that task. So storage, while it's going to be an important strategy, is not a sufficient strategy. We also have to look at source redundancy, building more capacity for electricity production than we'll actually need at any given moment. So if some sources are offline, they can be supplemented with other sources. Another way of doing that would be to build out more renewable energy capacity that's not intermittent, such as biomass or geothermal. But there we run into the potential limitations. There's only so much potential for biomass or geothermal. Now, if we didn't need nearly as much electricity, then it would be much easier to engineer a national system because the intermittency wouldn't be that big a problem. We could balance it out with some of these other sources. Also in this category of harder stuff, there are things like public transit systems. Some cities in the country already have robust public transport. I happen to live in a city, Santa Rosa, California, 150,000 people, and practically nothing. You know, we have some bus service, and that's about it. There are a lot of towns like Santa Rosa. No freight rail goes into Santa Rosa. So building out public transit and rail service throughout the country is going to be a longer process, and it's going to take more energy and investment. How about freight, shipping? We've globalized our economy over the past 3 decades or so, for better or worse, and I think a pretty good argument could be made that it really was for the worst. But nevertheless, currently we're dependent on global supply chains for raw materials and finished goods. And when we talk about transport, we usually think about moving people. In fact, in terms of tonnage, we move far more stuff than people. So how are we going to move all that stuff? When we're moving it around the world, shipping is, from an energy efficiency standpoint, very efficient. But those big ships run on oil. How do we take oil out of the equation? It's not going to be easy. That's why it's in this category. We can add kite sails and reduce the amount of oil, make shipping more energy efficient by maybe 60%. But that doesn't take oil altogether out of the equation. Then buildings. We've talked about substituting air source heat pumps, electric-powered air source heat pumps for natural gas heaters. But we really need to transform our whole building stock in this country, because most of the buildings that we live in, we work in, schools, hospitals, all the rest, were built during this brief historic era where we had so much abundant cheap energy that it seemed to make sense to put up structures that were poorly insulated and where all of the services were supplied by massive energy inputs. It doesn't have to be that way. We know how to construct buildings that are far more energy efficient. It's being done in Germany by the passive house movement, building structures like this house that use 5% or 10% of the energy of a standard building. Very simple principles. Now, these principles were actually discovered and pioneered here in the United States back in the 1970s during the energy crises. Maybe you remember reading the Whole Earth Catalog and publications like that. Energy engineers were, having a field day back then. But come the 1980s and Morning in America and cheap oil, all of that was more or less forgotten. Meanwhile, in Germany, they read all that stuff and actually started putting it into practice. So what we need to do is build a passive house movement here in the United States and change our building codes and building standards so that they require this level of insulation and efficiency. And then we have to start addressing our existing building stock and the retrofitting process that's going to be required for the millions of homes and buildings. Now, the really hard stuff. In case you think what we've already covered isn't hard enough, the really big buildings, like we see in downtown Boston and cities around the country, are built mostly of concrete and steel. Concrete and steel are going to be difficult to transition because they're made with industrial processes that require high heat and currently large amounts of fossil fuels. This is particularly the case with concrete. The main ingredient, the key ingredient, I should say, of concrete is cement. Cement is produced in these giant kilns that operate at like 1,500 degrees centigrade. And of course, the energy for that industrial process is usually coal, sometimes natural gas. Now, we could substitute, theoretically, some kind of renewable energy for that process, maybe, huge mirrors focusing sunlight, or, we could use solar PV panels to make some kind of fuel that we could then burn to produce. But the reason it's not done that way now is that it's overwhelmingly likely that it would be much more expensive than the way the stuff is currently produced. So realistically, I think we have to look forward to a future in which we have a lot less concrete and steel. That means using more local natural materials in building, more recycled materials, and building more to human scale. Over the course of the last few decades, especially in wealthy industrial countries like the United States, we have increased the amount of space enclosed per person. A simple way of thinking about that is the average size of an American home. It's gone from 1,000 square feet to 2,400 square feet. Now, what we need to do realistically in the energy transition is reverse that trend to where we're enclosing less space per person. Now, that could have some advantages. We could actually build structures that are more beautiful and that last a lot longer and that are more comfortable to be in than our current structures. But we have to change our whole design philosophy in order to do that. Manufacturing. Much of our manufacturing in terms of assembly processes is already electrified. However, manufacturing ultimately depends upon resource extraction. And the processes for resource extraction that we currently use are going to be difficult to electrify. Not impossible, but the pathways that David Fridley and I were able to identify are, again, ones that will likely entail higher costs and a long period of research and development and engineering before we can make those substitutes. Also, many of the materials that we currently use in manufacturing are themselves fossil fuel products, primarily plastics, but also other kinds of petrochemicals. And massive amounts of these materials find their way into fabrics and paints and lubricants. Just walk into your office or your home office or your kitchen and look around you at all of the objects and the machines and the utensils that incorporate plastics or paints or other kinds of petrochemicals. You'll be rather amazed at the difficulty you may have in finding something that doesn't embody fossil fuels. So changing the materials that we use that's going to be a challenge in itself. And in our research, we found some areas that were just intractable. You know, we were looking at public health and pharmaceuticals, and we consulted a whole array of experts in all of these different issue areas, and and all of them are sympathetic to the idea of the energy transition and themselves very much involved in it in their work. But the public health professional we talked to, when we started asking about, you know, alternative pharmaceuticals that don't involve any kind of fossil fuel inputs, he said, well, that's not going to be easy. We're really talking about you know, decades down the line and lots of research in order to make those kinds of substitutions. So that gets to the question of how we use the fossil fuels that remain. Are we going to use them, you know, to fly to Las Vegas for the weekend? Or are we going to use them for absolutely necessary purposes, like maybe making some pharmaceuticals to prolong people's lives, or using them to build solar panels and wind turbines and better insulated buildings and public transit infrastructure and so on? We have to think of our remaining fossil fuels as being far too valuable to burn without giving it some real serious thought as to what we're using them for. So again, smaller scale, probably using more human labor again in manufacturing, at least for certain kinds of objects and material and products, using more recycled and natural materials, building more for reuse and repair, and we really think this spells the end of consumerism. Now, consumerism was an engineered trend, right? During the course of the 20th century, we had a real economic problem on our hands, which was the problem of overproduction. With cheap fossil fuels, we could make so many consumer products so fast in such large quantities that you know, there was the danger of just overwhelming markets, and that's one of the things that led to the Great Depression. So with the help of advertising and consumer credit, we engineered a whole new kind of economy, the consumer economy, where instead of citizens, we became dutiful consumers, and it was our duty to go out and buy stuff so as to create jobs, so as to keep the economy moving. And you know, if the World Trade Center is attacked and buildings fall, what are we asked to do as citizens? Go out and buy stuff. Do your job as a consumer. Well, we are moving into a different kind of economy, the end of the consumer economy and the dawn of the conserver economy. One of the hardest areas that we looked at was consumer electronics. You know, these things are made using high heat industrial processes, made of materials that are extracted using processes that require enormous amounts of fossil fuels. And the bits and pieces are shipped all around the world for individual processes of production and assembly before they finally get to you. And of course, many of those assembly processes take place in countries where labor is very cheap and not very well, and people whose labor we're depending upon are treated essentially as slaves. So the way we see this unfolding is rather than, you know, in the future looking at expecting to replace your smartphone every 18 months with a brand shiny new model, we should expect when we turn 18 to get our smartphone, and then for the rest of our lives, or a good part of our lives, to find ways to repair, replace, recycle, upgrade, but do that in a way that produces the least amount of waste and requires the least amount of embodied energy. Another area where we found no really good easy substitute solutions is aviation. Now, theoretically, we could have planes flying on sophisticated biofuels, but those biofuels are going to be expensive, and there will be environmental trade-offs with producing them. Or we could fly planes on cryogenic hydrogen. But where are the prototypes? How much is that hydrogen going to cost? What's the energy efficiency of producing it? Realistically, we see this as an industry, an entire industry, that has very little future. Now, it's entirely likely that we could have vestiges of aviation preserved for specific purposes. There's a solar airplane that's flying around the world right now, and electric aircraft are in principle possible. A few of them do exist, but these are aircraft that carry 1 or 2 passengers. We're not talking about 747s carrying 350 people. The batteries would be too heavy for them to take off, even with massive improvements in battery technology. So realistically, we're looking at a massive shrinkage of this industry. So we should be planning for that. Rather than building new airports and enlarging landing strips and so on, we should be looking at the energy efficiency of transport modes and building out rail, and not necessarily, high-speed rail, but low-speed rail, because that happens to be the most energy efficient way of moving stuff on land, by far. One opportunity that we were able to identify in this whole process, and it's a huge opportunity, is in agriculture. We talked about transitioning the food system. But this is not just an opportunity for reducing the amount of CO2 we're putting up into the atmosphere. This is also an opportunity for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, back where a lot of it actually was before we started with modern industrial agriculture. So I don't know if you've heard the phrase carbon farming. But the folks who are really thinking creatively about the energy transition are very excited about the potential for carbon farming. The thing is, it's going to take a complete change in orientation for our agricultural systems toward regenerative agriculture that's based around low input, diverse agroecology. So those are the 3 levels that we were able to identify. And again, we're going to have to do all of this stuff at the same time, basically. Starting now, if we're going to be successful, we're going to have to do our level best and aim for a level of energy production and use that is sufficient for our needs. Not an energy economy that's based on the industrial growth model that was developed during the 20th century on the basis of fossil fuel energy inputs. Why so? Well, I could go into the technical challenges of producing enough energy, but think of it maybe in a simpler way. How many of us are familiar with the global footprint network, the idea of the ecological footprint? Then you're probably also aware that the global footprint network has calculated that if all of the services provided for humanity currently had to be provided in a sustainable way from the ecosphere, it would take 1.5 Earths worth of productivity on an annual basis to provide all those services. And if everyone in the world were going to live at the US standard of living, it would take 4 Earths worth of productivity. Now, the way we get around that, the way we produce all of this with only 1 Earth currently, is by drawing down future productive capacity, by taking fish out of the oceans and cutting forests faster than they can regrow, basically borrowing on the ecosystem that our children and grandchildren will have to depend upon. So we know that we're going to have to reduce the energy and material throughput of society anyway. So we should be aiming for a national energy system, particularly in already industrialized countries like the United States, that is smaller and significantly more efficient than the energy system that we currently have. That means the energy transition will involve social and psychological and attitudinal adaptation every bit as important as the technical or engineering efforts that we've been talking about. Is this just a matter of unplugging the coal power plant and plugging in a solar panel and continuing to live the way we do now? Absolutely not. This is a civilization reboot. Then the question of equity. Now, renewable solar and wind provide an opportunity for greater energy equity. But it's only an opportunity if we seize it. It's entirely possible to imagine a renewable energy future that's every bit as inequitable as our fossil fuel present. If only the communities, if only the neighborhoods, if only the countries that can afford massive investment in renewable energy capacity make that investment now, then we could end up in a future where, rich people have solar and wind power and everybody else has basically nothing. So we have to think about these equity issues as we make the transition and capitalize on the opportunity for solar and wind by making them cooperatively and community owned wherever possible. So the opportunities involved in the transition are actually enormous. At the end of the day, we could have a society that's not just more energy efficient, but one that's where we know the people who are growing our food and growing some of it ourselves, where we live in communities that are more localized and live in buildings that are more comfortable and more beautiful and more durable. There's more of a sense of intergenerational connection. And the health impacts from fossil fuels are a distant memory, and we're actually removing carbon from the atmosphere through the processes that grow our food. There will be some costs with the transition. Obviously, massive investment. It's going to take regulation. The market is not going to do this. It's going to take things like carbon taxes and renewable portfolio standards and so on. We can talk about that later if you want. But more than anything else, a change in our behaviors and expectations. We're looking at a different kind of economy, and the sooner we can grasp that, the better off we'll be. Altogether, this is the challenge of our lifetimes. There's really nothing more important than this. This tells the tale about whether we survive climate change or not, whether we have functional economies 100 years from now or not, whether we fight over the last drops of oil or leave oil behind, perhaps for future generations to find something good to use it for. I don't know. But this is the cause of our times, and it's the opportunity to do this work over the last year has been really exciting and humbling. And I hope you avail yourselves of the opportunity of looking at our website, ourrenewablefuture.org. The entire text of the book is available there, plus a lot of material that's not in the book. We undertook this project, analytic project, as a public service. And if you know of people who could benefit from this information and this analysis, please share it with them. Because our our capacity as a small nonprofit think tank to get this information out is limited. So we would welcome your help with that. So I'm sure I've been talking for way long enough, and I trust we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, folks. All right, I want you to try something with me. If there was a fact that you just heard that made you want to do something, if you could think of that fact, let me let you find it. Now, I want you to think about how it made you feel. What is it about that fact? What did it connect to in your life or your history that made you want to do something, that motivated you to act for change? All right, if I haven't given you enough time, I encourage you to think through that question a little bit more later. The reason I ask you this question is because we often forget that facts don't change people. We need facts. But the things that actually change us and cause us to act differently are our feelings, or our emotional responses to those facts. We need presentations like this one to help give us the information that we need to move forward and to chart a course, right? But it's really, really easy for all of us doing this work to get motivated by this fact or that fact, and then to go out from this place and to just start dumping those facts on other people. And the thing is, the fact that motivates you to do a particular thing or to feel a particular way, you have no idea how that fact is going to land on me when you tell it to me. So when you tell it to me, you need to tell me why it drives you. You need to tell me the story about how it makes you feel, about what you're concerned about what point in your life or what things you care about in your life were connected for you to that fact to motivate you to want to act. Tell me that story when you tell me the fact. Help me understand why this fact should motivate me as well. Again, we need to hear presentations like this. We need people doing the hard work of laying this out for us, but most of us aren't doing that part of the work. Most of us receive the information, feel some sort of connection to it, and then it's our job to get out there and spread the word in ways that can draw other people in. So, some other time we can practice telling those stories to each other. I'd be happy to practice those with anybody. It's one of the things I love to do. So, because we don't change based on facts, we change based on how we feel about those facts individually. We also don't change based on individual action alone. I was really encouraged at the end there when we were hearing, the costs are going to include, we're actually going to have to change, right? And so I want to encourage us all to think about, based on this presentation, I would add another cost. Perhaps our need to be respectable. So I want to say that I know a lot of people in this room have spent a lot of your lives banking up your respectability. It's useful in some settings, but I want to remind us all that we can't take it with us. And maybe now's the time to spend it. We just heard that there's nothing more important we could be doing than figuring out this transition. And I think that means that this is the thing we spend our respectability on. So to me, that means, that leads me to this question that I'm going to leave you with in this response, which is, why are we being so nice? And by nice, I don't mean we should be mean, but I have this experience. I'm from the Midwest, from a sort of like working class, rural part of the Midwest where nobody had time to like shelter me from just direct communication. And I often feel like we're sheltering each other. We're just being real nice around here. And so what I mean by why are we being so nice is, can we start to tell each other the truth about what is really going on and what we're really facing? Because not telling the truth hasn't worked. For years we said, oh, we don't want to scare people. I'm not about scare tactics. I'm about let's tell the truth, and then let's figure out together in community how we then live accordingly. How do we need to act in light of the truth? So I hope that that's what our civilization reboot is going to look like. And I look forward to exploring that with you all today.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Transformation seems to be the theme right now. We're all thinking about transformation, and we're thinking about systems. And what I'm recognizing constantly, that it's all intersectional. Whether we're talking about an education system, economy system, a food system, health system, an energy system, they're all interconnected. As Richard was talking about transportation, I was thinking about my food system work, and we're looking at safety, we're looking at transportation, we're looking at how we think about and how we help people own and be responsible for their behaviors and really be active participants in that system. And so what really bubbles up for me is that whatever we're doing in the energy system, we need to do, particularly right now, you spoke so much referencing our food system, really look at the linkages there and build power around that. Now there were, of course, I was very, very excited when I was reading Richard's pieces about constantly making the case for equity. Because when you think about this transformation and building new systems and thinking about saving our planet and saving our food system, we have to start to think about equity. Richard had there foundational. It is foundational to any transformation that is going to be sustainable, that is going to be saving the planet, making sure that our children and all those generations to come have a safe place that they can live, that they can grow, and they can prosper. And so it is always at the core of any transformation we're thinking about. And so I would always ask the question, I'm thinking about equity all the time, right? That I live it, so I think about it all the time. But it's really easy, if it's not your lived experience, not to. And so it really is, when you talk about challenges and transformation and being new selves and entering in a space of renewal, authenticity, and really what we need as a Jamaica Plain community, as a Boston community, as we talk about state and our regional work, really what we need to be thinking about is, where are we in that conversation? Are we using our privilege? Are we using our power to inform, to educate, to activate, to really make this change? So as Richard's talking about, all this is required, it requires us to be different people too. So in order to make the energy piece work, we have to be thinking about it differently. Affordability, oh my. When he spoke about that, to shift, we're gonna have to make some tough decisions and balancing all that out. And we have to be making that together and with everybody that is going to be part of that system. So as we're talking today, it's so exciting that we have the opportunity to have this learning. And Richard, I love the fact that you say, how can you get it and share it with other people? Absolutely, but I would also even say that as we think about our different audiences, so there's different languages, as well, and there are different ways to communicate it. So it can be the PowerPoint, it can be your writing, it could be a song, it could be a story. But just think about all the different ways so we can get the message out about our energy and how we can be more sustainable and equitable in that, because we have to. I think about the fact that it is not an easy thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. If we are really serious about an equitable system, it means doing things differently. It means even looking at our policies and practices. So thinking about having this event and thinking about who to invite, where to publicize it, where to handicap access, all of the opportunities here, the time of day, the location, and what kinds of things do you want people to know that they will learn? Just putting it out in plain English, just communicating, using all the tools and the skills we have to do it differently. But we have to make a decision in our hearts that it is the only way that we're going to be able to create a sustainable society, and one which we all can benefit from, not some, but for all of us to benefit from. And it really, again, requires a shift in thinking, because we come from a historical place that this country was not built that way. So it's very important that how we sometimes live our lives is not by our design, but it's a system. And systems are there, but people can change those systems. And I think that's what really has to be the energy behind that. We have the power to change the system because we're the ones activating it. We're the ones going through the policies, going through the steps. But it is so important that we begin to think more intentionally about our behaviors, our practices, and think about where is the equity in that. Every single day, where is the equity in that? And when you think about that first, there are a lot of things you will do differently. A lot of things you will do differently. So I really challenge us to think about equity in everything, and everything we're doing, think about where is the equity in that, and continue to think today about energy and later a little bit with me on food. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and be able to be in this conversation. So thank you.
All right, well, I was just going to moderate a little bit of question and answer for both Richard and our, so maybe actually like Marla and Karen to just sort of join in questions for any three of our speakers.
Yes, the question of population, we do talk about that in the book. Currently, world population is growing on a net basis by about 80 million per year. So think about what that means. It's it's a London, a New York, a Los Angeles, and maybe another major city or two, plus a little. That's what we're adding every year on a net basis, and presumably providing shelter, energy, food, etc. for all these folks. It makes all of the challenges that we talked about earlier much more difficult. So we can't any longer push the population subject off for the future. It's a human rights issue as much as anything else. The countries where population is growing fastest, think of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, so on. These are countries that are going to have enormous human rights challenges and survival challenges. Many of these countries are already approaching the condition of a failed state simply because of the rate of population growth and the challenges that implies. So how do we address this? Clearly, the ways that have worked best over the past few decades, raising the the education level of women, changing cultural norms so that women have more control over fertility and family size. One of our post-carbon fellows is a gentleman named Bill Ryerson, who runs the Population Media Center, and one of the strategies that they have used is to enlist the work of creative people in often poor countries with very high population growth rates to develop radio soap operas or TV series. And millions of people in these countries tune in and get involved in the lives of the characters in these serial dramas. And written into the scripts as time goes on are the kinds of issues that families, individuals face when confronting cultural norms around, for men in many of these countries, for example, there is the cultural norm. Having a larger family equals more status, higher status. Well, how do you change that cultural norm? By having these conversations, and these are the kinds of conversations that get started. And subsequent surveys have found that this kind of culture change is actually the cheapest and most effective way of reducing fertility, much more effective than just distributing free birth control. So, yes, it's a very, very important issue, and there's lots that we can do. There are no easy answers to that question. Clearly, you mentioned government debt for the U.S., but there's massive government debt in countries around the world. China has taken on massive debt in recent years, and much of this has been in an effort to forestall the kind of financial collapse that we nearly saw in 2008. Meanwhile, there's massive consumer debt, if you will, student loans, auto debt, house mortgages, and so on. How can we pay back all of this debt without more economic growth? Answer is, we probably can't. One way or another, massive amounts of debt are going to be defaulted upon, have to be written off. This is nothing new. This has happened in nations since the beginning of money. Money is itself a form of debt. And societies reliably go through cycles of building up massive amounts of debt and then seeing waves of default. So understanding that this is more or less inevitable should help us plan for it, so that we can do it in a way that is, again, more equitable and that involves the least amount of human suffering. So building more, this is one of the reasons that as an organization, Post-Carbon Institute is interested in building community resilience, because this kind of financial or economic transition is going to be a whole other set of challenges. I mean, we just spent a considerable amount of time looking at the engineering challenges of building a renewable energy future. We could easily spend an equal amount of time talking about the financial and economic challenges involved in getting to a post-growth economy. And I actually wrote a book exactly on that subject called The End of Growth. But whether we're looking at the climate challenges facing us, the energy transition challenges, or the financial challenges, all of them, I think, are going to require us to address them very largely at the community level, where we deal with the people around us and the difficulties, the suffering, the opportunities that are available right in front of us that we can help to avert, bear, share, or otherwise address. And so I urge you to avail yourself of our website, resilience.org, which has as its focus looking at not just the challenges, but what people are doing in the sharing economy, in permaculture, in carbon farming, in local economic enterprise, and so on, to move us through this interesting time. In general, on a direct basis, the answer is no. I mean, I've spoken with Bernie Sanders, energy committee, and they get a lot of these issues. I presume and see, pretty strong evidence that he gets these issues. He's not likely to be the Democratic nominee at this point. Does Hillary Clinton get these issues? I think only very distantly, if at all. Does Donald Trump? I kind of don't think so. Jerry Brown? Jerry Brown gets a lot more than he lets on in public. I can't say I know Jerry Brown well. I have met him and talked to him briefly, and I know some folks like Tom Steyer in California who definitely have his ear. So he has a much more sophisticated take, I think, in private on many of these issues than he does in public, as I think is probably true with someone like President Obama. I think he probably understands a lot more about climate change and some of these looming challenges than he is likely to say in public, and we may, hear from him once he's out of office. We may hear him say things that we wish he had said. But the system, really, the political system, the systems of power within the country, and here I'm talking about Wall Street, the foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C., the military-industrial complex, and so on. These systems of power really constrain high-level policymakers in terms of what they're able to say, and sadly, in many cases, what they're able to do. So that's why it's so important that those of us who see these issues put as much pressure as we possibly can on these folks, because without that pressure, there's nothing for them to respond to but those traditional power centers. I made the statement earlier that coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels in terms of CO2 release, but what about natural gas, which is methane, and methane is another greenhouse gas which is, over the short term, far more potent than CO2. Yeah, this is really important analysis, and the more we find out about methane release, by far the picture gets worse and worse all the time. What we're seeing is the systems of pipelines in this country under city streets and under farmland connecting one community to another and so on. All of these pipelines are leaking all over the place, and the total amount of methane, if it's accurately counted, is likely to end up being a worse climate offender on a energy unit basis than CO2 from coal. So it's not just about getting rid of coal. Natural gas is just as important. And the idea, by the way, I know this was not on your question, but the idea of the U.S. being a natural gas exporter, it ain't going to happen, and any efforts in that direction should be fought and stopped with all due energy and haste, because from an economic standpoint, an energy standpoint, it does not make sense. The U.S. is still, at this point, technically a net natural gas importer. U.S. natural gas production is now in decline. So there is no sense whatsoever in building U.S. natural gas export infrastructure.
I think that's a good moment for, I'll come to your question, but I wanted to ask Marla, because when Richard said, how do we stop gas exports post-haste, there was like a light flashed over Marla's head. So I thought I'd...
The West Roxbury lateral pipeline is our only actively, like, under construction, permitted fracked gas pipeline project in Massachusetts. It's part of a larger project called the Algonquin Incremental Market from Spectra Energy, you know, this Houston-based company that they're just really trying to push more gas up through Massachusetts eventually to try to get it to export. The reason this West Roxbury lateral project, it's a small pipeline in the big picture, but it's high pressure. There are a lot of stupid things about it in terms of its immediate local health and safety impacts, and things like we already have more than 3,000 leaks in our Boston gas transmission system, and they're going to plug a high pressure pipeline into that and pressurize it some more. So all those leaks are just going to leak more than they already are, which is super amazing, because it's cheaper for them to do it that way than it is to fix all of those leaks. Now, if you see all of the big housing development projects that are going up all over Boston, all the big buildings, I was told 2 weeks ago that the developers of those buildings are being told by National Grid, which is the only consumer, or the only customer of this new pipeline project, that they need to buy in and help get that project built if they want to serve their high-end luxury condos with gas fireplaces and gas stoves. And so it's like capturing that development energy and all of that, those sunk costs that people already have in it, to say to those developers, you have to help us push this through. This is a big deal because Spectra Energy has 2 more pipelines in the permitting process for Massachusetts. And we really need to stop them here. And we really need your help to do it. Whether that means you get in the street in front of a bulldozer, or it means you come and cheer for the people who do. We'll have flyers for you this afternoon. They're like brand new developed, so we have to print some. We have a week of action it's 10 days of action from June 19th to the 29th in West Roxbury. We've got lots of training throughout that time to help get you ready. But we need you to be there. We need you to commit to showing up on one of those days because we need to stop this. We need to show the world that it's not okay with us and we have to draw the line. It's one of the ways that we get to know each other a little bit better and build the resistance in ways that aren't just like me showing up by myself and screaming with a sign, but me showing up with this many people who I begin to know and work together and trust each other to stop business as usual. This is the summer when we need to stop business as usual. We can start with West Roxbury because that's the one they're building. So we hope that you'll join us. Again, we'll have flyers after lunch. But resistthepipeline.org in the meantime.
Well, you speak about Hillary and Bernie, and I'm not so sure that she has as much support of the black community as it looks. They really had to go out and you know how they use their chips? There was a lot of negotiation to make some of that happen. But I always feel that when I come in, I'm invited to talk about equity and talk about food and all of those things, that there needs to be more of people, diverse cultures in the room. When I was talking a little bit earlier, it's all about how we communicate. It's our, whatever the flyer is, it's about where we place the flyer, it's about multilingual flyer. If we make it urgent, I mean, so when we talk about climate, the politicians aren't even getting it, right? I mean, we've been talking about for how many years, and it has to be the floods and the droughts and all the crazy temperatures for people to finally say, it might be happening. It might be, but they still won't commit to the fact it is and it needs to be invested in. And that is the same way that we approach equity in our country. So it really is important to think of different ways, different times of day. So I would say that most people are out working today. right? And so Saturday is either their day to get all their errands done. Even teenagers are doing that now. They feel they work so hard during the week that Saturday is their day of rest and day to get the errands done. But for others, it's still their day of work and income. But what I always find is we have to make the connection to the out there thing, because it's so out there, to my lived experience, to my daily struggles, my daily concern about my children having food, us having a roof over our heads, whatever, we have enough in our pocket to get to the tea. So we have to always think about, it's not, the question one of my friends says, he says that people say, well, where are they? That's the question. Where are the people? Where are the people of color? They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And we just have to open our eyes and look, and then also reach out and make that connection. But again, it's about communication, about where you're sharing it, having, wherever you're going, you see somebody, talk about what's happening in terms of your canvassing and things. Anybody you see will be helpful. I'm going to say something, and I'm just going to make a general comment, that we have to always say hello to anyone we pass. Really, you don't know who that person is. And I have to say, I came into this space in the other room, and people walked by me and didn't say hello. And when I said hello, they said, okay, and walked by, because they didn't know me. So after I've talked now, you know me, right? And so you will speak to me. But the fact that I could come into a place of God, a religious place, coming for the same thing you're coming for, that no one said, hi, what's your name? Hi, where do you live? What brought you here today? The only person who spoke to me was Sarah, who knew I was coming. She's scared. Are you coming? Are you here? You're almost here. But I think we have to change that dynamic in terms of when we're in a space and somebody's walking in, you welcome them, no matter whether you know them or not. And that's how we start doing that naturally. And then we'll start being able to create those new communities, those new ways of reaching out, because there's so much, I said it earlier, so much intersectionality in our lives that we have to come from a place of grace and knowing and extending when we're in a place, especially when you're in a place of privilege. Extending as opposed to stepping back and waiting. So I would invite you to be more extending, more creative. Everybody wants to be at this table. And whether they're at this table or another table, they are thinking about it and working on it. I was just at a food summit last 3 days in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I say, my colleagues, probably 2/3 white, other third of color. But we came together talking about the food system in the same way we're talking about the energy system. And just really the intersectionality of what we're all doing. And how wherever we are, there is a place at this huge table that we're sitting. We want to prepare. We want to make sure it's sustainable. We want to make sure that people can continue to benefit generations to come, because people worked hard for us to be where we are. So we have to do the same and honor that. But we have to, as Richard said, we have to be different. We can't be the same. We have to be different. We have to be bold, and we have to be courageous. And that does mean sometimes stepping out of our comfort zone to make sure that we are all moving forward, because without all of us, we will not succeed. So thank you for asking that question. But I am so grateful again, Sarah, for inviting me, because again, I get to talk about the food system. And again, I think it's so important that it's all connected. So the food can't move without energy. The food can't be harvested without energy. And we think about all the ways of more diversity. We think about that workforce diversity. And also creating more jobs, training, employment. Livable wage, we shouldn't be talking about livable wage. It should be a quality life wage. And that we can incorporate into the things we're talking about for our energy system, as well as our food system. So it's, again, thinking about all these systems are interconnected and how we can move it forward in an equitable, sustainable way. And we have the power as individuals and collectives to make that happen. So I just challenge you with that.
Listening to this, it might be tempting to think that all we need to do is return to a kind of pre-1980s, pre-Thatcher, pre-Reagan Keynesian model, mixed economy, less privatized, more regulated form of capitalism. And I think if it was 1990 or 1995, we might be able to respond to the crisis in that way. But here's the thing. There is what Michael Mann describes, the famed climate scientist at Penn State University, a procrastination penalty when it comes to carbon emissions, which means that if you allow emissions to increase by 61% instead of reducing them, you then need to cut them so rapidly and so deeply that it starts to present a fundamental challenge to the very core of our economic system. And this is why the subtitle of the book is Capitalism versus the Climate, because it challenges the fundamental logic of a growth-based economic system.